This is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Diamine Polar Glow. I'll do a writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper. I'll take a look at writing samples that I did earlier on 20-pound copy paper and 80 GSM Rhodia. I'll show some inks from my collection that are comparable to Diamine Polar Glow. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test. It was enjoyable writing with Polar Glow using a glass dip pen. The ink came off the nib smoothly and uniformly. The swatch that I made with tweezers was nice and crisp. And the name of this ink seems appropriate since the swatch gradually switches from a really dark blue to a dark but still bright turquoise color. It looks like it is glowing. The drip at the end of the swatch has a bright pink sheen. The beginning of the glass dip pen scribble where it was heaviest also has a bit of sheen, as well as the beginning of the ink swatch where ink was laid down heaviest. I'm going to begin with the Pilot 78G Plus. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. This pen was a joy to do writing samples with, especially on papers that I guess are smoother, papers that are harder, that don't have a texture to them. This Tomoe River paper, that was very nice. An extra fine nib like this is very enjoyable to write with on these small grids, and this is nice and legible. I'm gonna say this is smooth. Now it is an extra fine nib, and you just can't get away without there being feedback, especially relative to like a broad nib. But for this extra fine nib, I consider this smooth. Next, I've got my Lamy logo. I've replaced the stainless steel nib that it came with this extra fine 14 karat gold nib. And the entire nib is 14 karat gold. I often get questions if it's just this little section around the breather hole and nib slit. Is that the only part that's gold? No, the whole thing is gold. This is just a two-tone nib, and the part that looks silver is rhodium plated. Now notice the difference between the Pilot Extra Fine and the Lamy Extra Fine. This was a joy to write with. I was going to say this is a much wetter writer, but there's not a lot of ink that's being put down, and I'll talk about that a little bit more when I look at some of the other writing samples, but this was glassy smooth. And this nib, I've noticed, almost has just a slight architect type grind to the tipping. The downstrokes are just ever so slightly more narrow than the side strokes, and I just like how it makes my handwriting look. Next, I have a Pilot Custom Heritage 91. It has a 14 karat fine nib. Okay, you can see, now this is a fine nib, and it is a touch less broad than the Lamy logo Extra Fine. But it's much wetter. The Lamy logo was glassy smooth, but I wouldn't call this glassy smooth. I can feel a bit of feedback, but it is still a hard start there. It is still very smooth. I'm wondering if this ink, since it tends to sheen so much, if it will dry quicker, like when you pause while writing, if it will dry out on the nib a little bit quicker. Next, I've got a Pilot Custom 74. It has a 14 karat medium nib. About the same amount of wetness as the fine nib, but just because of the more tipping on this medium, it was back to being glassy smooth. Next, I'll be writing with my Quebeco Percayo All Black. It has a black stainless steel medium nib. Bit of a hard start there. Okay, nice and wet. I just like how it felt writing with this nib. It was smooth, but it had a slight amount of feedback. I would call it chalky smooth. That was a very pleasant feeling, especially if you like to have a little bit of feedback, just a little bit as you're writing. Next, I've got a Pilot Pluminix. It has a stainless steel calligraphy medium nib. That was very enjoyable to write with. On some of the other writing samples, it was a little less pleasant. Not horrible, but this was definitely the most enjoyable of all the writing samples that I did. Those broad downstrokes felt like I was writing with a paintbrush. So, yeah, nice and smooth. Next, I've got a Quebeco Lily Put. It has a stainless steel broad nib. Just very smooth. Let me see. I wouldn't call it glassy smooth. This is more velvety smooth. Just the barest hint of feedback just makes it feel very luxurious. The broad dark blue line of ink that goes down on the page, again, it feels like you're writing with a paintbrush. And finally, I've got a Jinhao X750. It has a 1.5 stainless steel nib. Again, this nib just feels velvety smooth, just feels very luxurious, very satisfying to write with. While that dries, I'll take a look at the other two writing samples. The 20-pound copy paper was not very enjoyable to write on. As I was writing, you could see the ink spreading, and the edges look pretty rough. Not terrible, but it just wasn't enjoyable to write with. The reverse writing of the broad was a little bit nicer. It was enjoyable, but you had a finer line and less ink going down. The Pluminix felt a little dry. I felt like I could feel the nib slit wanting to catch on the paper. The Percayo, everything just felt okay until I got to the Lamy logo, and I was really surprised. Usually on copy paper, 14 karat nibs, since they tend to write a little wetter, I usually don't prefer them on copy paper because the ink just looks a little blobby and messy, but the Lamy logo was just very enjoyable to write with. That was a mistake. I wrote a F and had to correct it to a K, but it just put down such a nice, neat line. It was very smooth, and I liked that combination. But overall, I preferred the writing samples that I did on Rhodia paper. The sheen was more subtle. I should have mentioned, on the copy paper, there was no sheen that was apparent. It soaked into the paper and it bled through pretty bad. Not too much worse than previous inks. It's just that this is a darker ink, so you really see it. But on Rhodia, it doesn't bleed through, and you see a little bit of sheen on the heaviest parts. On wetter nibs, you see a bit more sheen, and on drier nibs like the Lamy logo, it comes across as brighter. The Pilot Pluminix and the Lamy logo, you see more of the turquoise of the ink. Each of these felt very enjoyable to write with, but I think my favorite was the Lamy logo. Actually, the Lamy logo and the Percayo and the Lily Put, those were they just felt very enjoyable to write with on this paper. I'm a fan of turquoise inks, but I'm very particular about the type of turquoise inks that I like to write with. It has to be pretty dark. I don't like it to be too bright or too light, and this is a nice shade of turquoise. So when I went through my collection, Noodler's Navy is very similar. It's a little bit lighter. Part of that is you've got this sheen that's just this red sheen that kind of alters the look of the ink and makes it look a little darker, makes it look a little more purple. I think I prefer the Noodler's Navy though. I'm not a big fan of red sheen on blue inks, and I'll talk about that a little more later. I guess it depends on what paper you use. Like I did like it on the Rhodia paper. Three Oysters Peacock is another favorite dark turquoise of mine. It has a little bit more of a dusty look to it, whereas the Polar Glow is a little bit brighter. And I had to pick out Organic Studio Santiago Sea Blue. It, I guess, is an ink you would consider a super sheener. Polar Glow is not quite a super sheener, but it does have a lot of sheen to it. Polar Glow is not water resistant. When I put it in the water, that turquoise ink just exploded off the page, and a lot of the Diamine inks that I've done water resistance tests on, the results looked like this, where you could almost read it, but it's not water resistant. Okay, back to the Tomoe River writing sample. The ink got pretty deep into the page on the really wet parts of the ink swatch and the wettest part of the writing sample with the glass dip pen. There's quite a bit of show through, but this is a dark, bright ink. There is lots of sheen everywhere. I'm seeing sheen on everything except there's sheen on the extra fine also. It's just not super apparent because it's such a fine line. I think the Rhodia paper was my favorite. It was a nice balance between the copy paper that had no sheen and Tomoe River that is just tons of sheen. And I think the reason I don't like red sheen on blue inks is because it reminds me of the old ballpoint pen ink, globs of it when you would go to write with the ballpoint pen the first time, and a big glob of ink would come out, and it would be that oily ink would be a dark blue with some red sheen to it. I think it just reminds me of that unpleasant writing experience. Alright, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.